Supply chains are struggling with uncertainty in the face of global tariffs, regulatory complexities, and protectionism. What to do? Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain, and I want to welcome you to this special presentation on successful supplier risk management requires a balanced trinity: strategy, governance, and resources. It's the first in a new series of 2025 webinars presented by Gartner. Quick reminder before we get started, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, procurement leaders must recognize that supply chain risks aren't just challenges to be mitigated. They're opportunities to embrace and strategically manage. Instead of shying away from risky sourcing arrangements, organizations need to invest in the management and nurturing of these critical supplier relationships. So today, we're going to discuss the key differentiators that will move your business from a reactive stance to one that builds proactive strategies for coping with new tariffs, sourcing risk, and global tensions. First, I want to tell you about the Gartner Supply Chain Symposium Expo. Two big events coming up in Orlando and Barcelona at this year's conference. We're going to learn about how to ensure business continuity and resilience. We're going to explore AI integration and how to improve visibility as a foundation for building resilience. May 5th through 7th, 2025 in Orlando, Florida. May 19th through 21st in Barcelona, Spain. Learn more at gartner.com/conf/sc. Register with that code GartnerSCB25 for an exclusive discount. Don't miss it. Stronger, smarter, more secure with GEP. Supply chain disruptions are inevitable. How you respond defines your success. GEP's AI-powered solutions give you the visibility, agility, and predictive intelligence to mitigate risks before they impact operations. From generative AI risk detection to proactive contingency planning, GEP's supply chain software helps leaders fortify their supply chains against volatility. Stay ahead of risks, protect your bottom line, and optimize every link in your supply chain. Ready to secure your future? Learn more today. www.gep.com. So with that, I want to introduce our speaker for today. Cheryl Van Dyke is a Senior Director Analyst within Gartner's Supply Chain Sourcing and Procurement team. Cheryl focuses on strategies for supplier and third-party risk management and resilience practices, including supplier metrics and assessments, multi-tier visibility, and supplier vetting within the supply chain ecosystem. She has more than 25 years of experience in risk, readiness, and supply chain. In addition to her extensive experience as a practitioner in the aerospace and defense industry, Cheryl has worked in the commercial sector, academia, and on the international stage. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you, Bob. It's good to be here. And thank you to Supply Chain Brain for hosting this.
Great to have you here. So what I want to do, let's get into the panel, Ask the Expert portion of our discussion. And you, Cheryl, of course, are the expert. I want to divide this into a series of topic headings that are of importance in this area. Let's start with the one that probably everybody's talking about most these days, and that is tariff policies and tariff trade policy and tariffs. So, Cheryl, how can we prepare for the possibility of tariffs?
That's a great question, and I think you're absolutely right. I imagine many people tuning in today are tuning in because they're curious about that question. So not only is it timely, but it's also one of those areas in which it demonstrates how important it is to do all the things that you mentioned in the intro, right? To have that proactive plan. We've been talking about strategies and proactive plans and resilience for a few years now. And this is one of those times where it's testing whether or not we actually have those things in place. We need that strategic foresight. We need that proactive management plan. And they can't just be buzzwords. We have to actually start making those changes. The people who are listening to us today, they know the complexities of this landscape. They know what it is to try and navigate these trade regulations and policies and the uncertainty. And what is important is to start controlling or even removing some of that uncertainty. That's what's going to start to make that difference and put you in a more proactive position. It's time to realize that we can't solve tariffs, right? None of us have that power to make that that go away. There's no magic solution that we've been hiding that specifically will prevent tariffs from coming to us in some way, whether it's directly, whether it is 7 tiers away from us. Those tariffs are going to make an impact. It's time to just accept it and then use that to actually make those decisions. We want to make sure we're staying informed. Talk to your subject matter experts. Lean into the technology. You're going to hear me talk about technology a lot today, and if I forget to mention it, just assume this is like one of those improv classes where you always add the and at the end. So whatever I say, and technology is really the answer. Because unless you have a very, very small supply network, and I'm thinking less than 200 suppliers, you have to have technology in order to manage the full landscape, to see the volatility and change of regulations, and to be getting early sensing, and to understand how that impacts you through your multi-tiers. I don't know how you do it without it. You also want to do a risk assessment. The uncertainty is fueled by the fact that we don't know, right? We don't know what is coming our way. We're not sure if we have suppliers or vendors who are passing through Canada or Mexico, for example. While we might be familiar with China because that's something we've been talking about for a number of years, we're unsure of those other things. So do that risk assessment. Is it really going to impact you, and at what magnitude? Is it something where you have to put all of your resources or just a portion of your resources? And then leverage scenario planning, right? Again, something we've been talking about for a number of years, but again, now is the time to do the things we've been talking about doing. Use that scenario planning, throw in some wild cards, think about the what ifs, and come up with some plans, short term as well as long term. And don't confuse your short term for long term, right? What's fixed today might not help you in the long run. You're going to hear me say another word that we use all the time: diversify your supply base. Again, if you've been talking about it, you know you should be doing it, then do it. It's time to start thinking about those alternatives. It's also time to start thinking a little bit out of the box on, should I be redesigning things and investing? Again, probably been talking about that for a couple of years, and you're kicking yourself for not starting it 2 years ago. But here's the time to start divesting and to start thinking about, can I make my network more robust and safer by doing that diversification? And then lastly, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
The last thing I want to say in this point is, this is also a time to think about more creative contracting or safer contracting. Do you have clauses in there that talk about triggers? So let's again accept that we will have price changes. Are there clauses in your contracts that talk about what triggers those costs being passed on to you? And if the inflation, or if the tariffs don't go into effect, or they're revoked in some way or reduced, do you have triggers that will pull those prices back? That's not something we often talk about, but that's an opportunity we have on the table. So again, accept it. It's going to happen. It's time to actually start putting into place all of those strategies that we've always talked about but haven't actually invested in.
Interesting. Optimistically, we could say that this particular disruption is actually fueling steps that should have been taken anyway, because for years we've been talking about looking to mitigate risk in our supply chains. And one way to do that is, as you point out, through diversifying your supplier base. But I wonder, how do you go about doing that, Cheryl? And once you have a diverse supply base, I mean, then you're depending less on one supplier, maybe not getting as good of a deal. You want to keep another one over here. You want to give them enough business so that in an emergency they'll serve you if you need them. Just tell me how you go about the beginning of the diversification of a supplier process.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's also a matter of clarifying or redefining diversification. I think in the most part, when we think about diversification, we've always thought about adding a second source or removing a source from the point of risk. So not having a source in China, not having a source in Mexico, and removing that completely, nearshoring, so to speak. There's other ways to think about that diversification that would be closer to maybe regionalization or globalization. You want to think about protecting the source. If that means dual sourcing, then that's an option. But there's also the idea of what we'd call China plus one, for example. So you recognize the fact that we still need that other source in China. But if we can stand up someone else in a zone that's not subject to the tariffs or other trade regulations, while that may cost us more, moving some of that to that other source gives us better leverage or protection when we need it. There's also the idea of shortening your supply chain. And we'll talk about this probably as we go in today and we talk more about regulations, right? But when you're faced with some of these regulations, sometimes the trick is to shorten the supply chain so there's not as much movement around the globe passing through customs and things. You have your prime manufacturer, production site, or service provider, and they're regionalizing where they're getting those sources versus having to collect materials around the globe, if you will. That can also control some of those costs and custom points. So when we think about diversification, we've got to think a little bit more outside of the box. Again, you want to start with thinking about your exposure and thinking about where are your biggest risks and how much that's going to cost you. So quantifying that in terms of impact and profits and cost of goods, sales. And then you also want to define your response, right? If it happens, when it happens, how are you going to do it? How much are you willing to invest? And what is your level of confidence in being successful in that area?
Okay, great. Let's take a broader view from the standpoint of this topic of geopolitical shifts and protectionism, which is a danger definitely in terms of inhibiting free trade. How should we adopt our supply chain strategies to navigate the resurgence of protectionist policies and regulatory rulings such as, for instance, the foreign direct product rules? Give us some guidance there.
Yeah, so the FDPR, the audience listening, I know the acronyms more than I know the actual words, so I always refer to it as FDPR. That extends right to US technology, for example, export controls beyond our border. That are, if we're selling it, they can't sell it again. By the way, while we have that in the United States, other countries have that as well, right? China has it. There's some rules in Europe as well. So it's not just within the United States borders. So it's important because it's almost like the cousin of tariffs, I'd like to say, right? We know it's going to happen. We know it could cause some increases. We know it could cause some increases in time and money. And so some of the same rules apply. You need to understand your regulatory environment. You need to do a risk assessment and scenario planning. You need to think more about your strategic sourcing, right? This is when it's important to expand that cross collaboration and work within your teams. Talk to your business development teams, talk to your design and engineering teams. Make sure they understand that when they choose a source or they're directing towards a source, the impacts that can have later on. You want to make sure that you are looking for opportunities to design new tech or replace tech that might be from a supplier in a volatile region, for example. And you, again, want to use those supplier relationships. We have to build transparency. And while 2018 still might have been the year where everyone was very self-protecting. We're talking about now global protectionism, but internally very, closed. We don't want to share our information. We think that's what gives us the competitive edge. Us, our suppliers, their suppliers, everyone is dealing with this. And so if we could open up those windows for transparency just a little bit, we'd have more cooperation and collaboration, and it would get a little easier for everybody. So building those supplier relationships is really important. We've already talked about diversification and globalization. That's going to be important. And again, regionalizing your global spots so that they can get more local sourcing and there's less movement around the globe. And then here's a big one. In going into the future, we really have to think about when we're a strategic sourcing organization and we have those people looking through the checklist of things they have to follow, start thinking about, is this supplier that I want to onboard or select for a project, are they aligned with our values and are they aligned with our ethics? Because many of those protectionist regulations put in some of those caveats, right? We're talking about those ESG type regulations and things. And while we've been thinking about human rights, there's going to be other things that will start to impact reputation and brand. And so it's really important to start thinking now. There's no reason we can't start implementing that now, not wait until it's a problem. But right now, when we're thinking about our sourcing, is this a supplier that supports our values, our ethical considerations, and will align with us going forward, or could they be a hindrance or tarnish us in some way, right? It's that supplier code of conduct. Now is the time to polish those off and represent those out to the public.
So here again, an opportunity to do something we should have been doing all along, even without these new policies.
100%.
Environmental, social, and government, ESG, and the like. Also on the side of protectionism, you're looking for, are you not, suppliers from countries where we don't have quotas or tariffs against them. So there's that. But what about also the idea of the so-called tariff engineering, where you're looking to get around through things like duty-free treatment or even changing the materials of a product so that you can source from somewhere a type of material that doesn't fall under a tariff category? That's also something to be explored, is it not?
Absolutely. Those are all possibilities to be explored. You want to be careful that you're not crossing a line, right? We've seen in the
Mm.
past, I go back maybe 5, 10 years, where you would see some of this, and there were activities that would walk that gray line of being truly ethical or legal. But there are a lot of opportunities out there that are well within the line of the law and what those regulations are supposed to do. This is where you really want to talk to your compliance teams, your logistics teams, your customs teams, whoever's managing those regulations, to understand what are your opportunities. Things like bonded storage, for example, which is one of my favorites. I come from the aerospace and defense industry, as you mentioned at the top of the hour, and
Hmm.
that's something that we would often leverage because it gives you that opportunity to buy the materials but store it outside the country, waiting to see how this is going to play out and waiting to bring that in when hopefully it's the least volatile time or the least expensive time. So there are a lot of those opportunities that you can take advantage of, and not just feel like our only option is we have price increases, we have to pass them on. It's really important to think about what are our other opportunities.
Are there opportunities here to achieve competitive advantage in this so-called re-globalized environment, or is it simply something you got to do that everybody's doing? It's just the price of admission now to being an international trader.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think most people don't see a competitive advantage. They can't wrap their heads around that. And so this is that opportunity because, again, accept it. It's happening. It's going to happen. You're going to see prices increases. You can't keep it out. It's going to creep in somewhere. So your chance is, while everyone else is worrying about just those price increases, take that competitive advantage. Think about, should we take action? What action should we take? And when should we take it? Again, yes, I understand taking that wait and see approach right now as we're waiting to see how the tariffs play out, how retaliations play out. But if you are going and doing scenario planning right now and you're seeing an opportunity, take it. There's no reason to wait. If you see something that's going to be more cost effective or build more resilience for you, do it. To your
Yeah,
point, to my point, right? These are things we should be doing anyway. So don't wait and see. The other
yeah.
thing is, and when we talk about that competitive advantage and investments, think about your must-haves, and again, don't sit back in that reactionary position waiting for it to happen. Invest now, right? What happens is I often see companies or organizations stuck in what I would call either commodity capabilities or keep up capabilities, meaning for a commodity capability, you are worried about what is going to be a low cost investment, even if I only get low returns on it, but it's safe. Or the keep up, which is really common, which is I'm going to invest just enough to maintain what I've always done and what's
Hmm.
always worked for us in the past. What they should be investing in, what's going to make that competitive advantage come to fruition is differentiating capabilities. Please don't make me say
Yeah.
that many times.
I
Which
promise you.
is what can I be doing? So it goes back. Let me go back one step, which is what do I do that's special and the customer loves? How can I do that more or enhanced?
Hmm.
And what do I need to invest it to make that more of kind of my specialty? So instead of kind of leaning back on, well, we can get away with this, and at a minimum, this will get us by, invest in what makes you good and what makes you wanted by consumers or your customers.
Hmm.
That's how you take advantage in these situations, by
Okay.
pivoting.
I want to move on to the
Yeah.
other upstream of the supply chain. We've been talking about downstream to the customer. What about the supplier? What makes up a good supplier risk management strategy today? One that will ensure operational continuity, regulatory compliance. How do you go about fashioning that?
Great question, and a great pivot. And I will say, you're going to hear me say a lot of the things we should already be doing, but let me talk about the areas in which we can do them a little better.
Okay.
One is really conducting that risk assessment. So even when people are leaning on technology, which is they should be, they often take a passive approach to it, right? I get a risk alert. Oh, this has a risky credit score. I guess I should do something. Build a risk assessment, set up the triggers internally, think about when you want to be more proactive, when you need to act immediately versus you have some time to make a longer term plan. You want to start with segmentation. As simple as that may sound, and although a lot of people talk about supplier segmentation, you want to make that uniform. You want to have those conversations cross collaboratively about what does critical mean to you. Because frankly, when you're in a room with 10 people, if you ask them what critical means, you get 20 definitions, right? So it's really important to make sure you're level setting those expectations. But segmentation, as simple as that is, and as everyone's doing it, they don't necessarily recognize it as that natural prioritization, right? When you segment your suppliers, you're saying these are the top suppliers. These are the ones that are most important to me. This is where I should focus my resources. This is where I should be investing in diversification or change or resilience, not on the majority, which is your transactional suppliers. And typically what's happening is the upside down, right? The transactional suppliers, because they're probably the larger quantity of your supply base, you're chasing them. You're putting out the fires, the day-to-day, everyday fire, squeaky wheels. You're overinvesting in those, right? If those are transactional suppliers, truly transactional suppliers, then they should fall within your risk appetite. You should be able to eliminate them or replace them relatively easy. And you're overinvesting in managing those day-to-day problems when you should be investing your higher resources into the strategic and critical
But
supply.
at the same time, Cheryl, you come out of A&D, you know that sometimes this is also in manufacturing of automotive and the like. The lack of availability of a single tiny part can bring an entire assembly line to a crushing halt.
It can.
And so are those, I mean, so you got to pay attention to that somehow. How do you balance that?
Yes, you do have to pay attention to that somehow. You're absolutely right. And my aerospace and defense friends still kind of like, well, Cheryl, that's not how it works in the real world. It's not how it works in the real world because we often, again, we get stuck in that rut. We allow that squeaky wheel to draw our focus. And because we are not setting risk appetite, which is really going to set that kind of foundation for all of your actions. How much risk are they willing to accept? Is an organization willing to accept versus mitigating to kind of counteract the risk? Now, when you talk about risk appetite with companies, they often immediately, the reaction is we're averse, we don't want any risk. Because they think about it in ones and zeros. They think about we have risk, you have to eliminate risk. Risk appetite becomes this differentiator in the idea of a risk management framework because it's saying, no, I don't have to bring a risk to zero. I have to bring it within risk appetite. And so if I have $1 million risk, for example, and my risk appetite is 250,000, I have to bring that million to 250,000. I don't have to bring it down to zero. And that's it's not as heavy a lift. I'm not overspending or over investing to try and bring that down to zero. Less meetings, less executive, sign off. Now, leaders don't like that word, risk appetite, because again, they think ones and zeros. And so my recommendation is start a conversation about non-negotiables. Start that conversation to say, okay, let's not talk about risk appetite. Let's talk about, give me a list of what are your absolute non-negotiables, those things that every supplier that we do business with has to have or has to meet. And when you start it there, it tends to lead the conversation in a different direction because they're more open to thinking about, all right, they have to have this. I'm okay with this. And then you start to create this risk appetite without them even knowing, right?
Yeah, and you build that into the contract with the supplier, do you not?
Exactly.
I mean, we hear about supplier codes of conduct. Maybe that's the ethical side of it, but there's a correlative there in terms of the things you expect of that supplier have to be written down in cold print, I would think.
Exactly. And that goes back to supplier relationships, right?
Yeah.
There's no reason to just dictate to suppliers because, again, suppliers are facing the same things you are. And they don't necessarily have any more control over them or any more visibility. And especially if they're smaller than you, they often have less control and less visibility than you would imagine. And so having those conversations with the suppliers of these are our non-negotiables, this is our risk appetite. How can we work together to make that a reality?
Right. Okay. All right. Again, this whole idea of the real world of the actual supply chain, there are going to be instances where you need single or sole sourcing because of a specific type of part that only a particular supplier can make. So, that being the case, what strategies can we adopt to embrace and strategically manage single and sole source suppliers?
The dreaded single and sole source, right? Everybody has them. In aerospace and defense, again, that was always the cry, right? And every time there's a new crisis, even with tariffs, we're hearing, oh my gosh, how can we become less dependent on our single and sole source? But as you said, they will always be there.
Hmm.
So let's accept that. We cannot just, there's no, again, magic solution that just eliminates single or sole sourcing. What you have to do is practice those good policies, practice those best practices in strategy. And you want to start by defining the difference between single and sole source. Many organizations lump it all together, right? They'll say single source. And when you pressure test a little bit to say, well, what does that mean to you? They don't necessarily have a defined category. They're looking at it as, well, we have to use this supplier. But if you start delineating between single source, which is there are alternatives in the world, we're choosing to go with this one, and sole source, which is there are absolutely no other options in the world, it starts to also help guide you in which direction you need to go with your strategy. Now, again, coming from aerospace and defense, I know that even though there might be other options in the world, I didn't have a lot of choice. Doesn't matter. If there is another option in the world, then you present that to your customer and you also help show them the difference of, we'll go this path because you've told us we have to. Here are the costs. Here's the risk management we have to put in place. Defining those from the start when you're onboarding those suppliers helps you understand, is it something where I need to, again, work with this supplier and build that relationship? Or is it a matter of defining then, because again, I can't solve single and sole source as a label, looking at the single or sole source and assessing the risk that they bring, if they bring risk beyond just being a sold number, right?
Hmm.
When you look at this, I often use examples such as, and I won't name names, I'll just say your computer operating systems, your cell phone providers, your laptop providers. You likely do not have multiple of those, right? They're a single or a sole source for you.
Yeah.
And we don't panic in that sense. So when you think about your single or sole source, think about if there is that niche. Are there suppliers that, because they have a robust reputation, they're well known, that they're already being held to higher scrutiny? They're already being accountable to all the high regulations. Maybe they even are kind of being watched by the government, if you will. So don't panic, right? Like tariffs, accept it's a fact, but then think about, where do they fall in that? Are they safer, single or sole source? And we just need to be monitoring the risk that they might actually be experiencing, financial risk, geopolitical risk. And then we manage them the same way we would manage any of our other suppliers if we're implementing best practices.
Yeah. Well, you could also have a single supplier, but geographical diversity too. That supplier producing in different parts of the world, which does mitigate to some extent if a particular region has a problem. Right.
Absolutely. And again, that's where you put in some of those other dual sourcing, diversification, divesting, or doubling down even, right? If
Yeah.
that's a sole source in a volatile region and you don't have any options, then double down, right? Protect that source as best as you can. Don't put the onus
Yeah.
necessarily only on the supplier. Take some of that responsibility. The last thing I'd say in this category is, by defining single versus sole, it also reflects back on the organization to say, what processes do we need to put in place? That single sole source justification, for example, or that form that often gets filled out. How can we improve that so that it's not just a checklist that gets kind of pencil whipped, if you will, right? How do we make that a form that is meaningful and shows the risk that we might be bringing into the organization by not being a little more forceful or being a little more competitive and looking for another source.
Yeah. Of course, once again, coming out of A&D, Cheryl, you must have seen the additional restrictions on supplier options because of, defense contracts, very much restrict who you can be sourcing from. They have to all be vetted. They have to all be approved. So you even have a narrower choice in
Oh
that
yeah.
case. And so even more challenges there. But I
And in
like
those,
go
yeah, I was
on.
just gonna say, in those cases in aerospace defense, you're right. There are some things you can't necessarily mitigate.
Yeah.
I would recommend in those cases, again, this is a place where, as the world evolves, as the supply chains evolve, and as even as aerospace and defense evolves, and you see more kind of commercial players join that space, there has to be more allegiance between the competitors in that space, the competitors in that space. They're all using the
Mm-hmm.
same sources, even if they're sole sources, right? The culture of that industry has to change.
Do you recommend a standard method of quantifying risk exposure by a number or a grade or a score, or is it more loosey-goosey than that? I'm just wondering how you get your hands around kind of conceptualizing the respective risk of one supplier over another.
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways to do it. One, again, you can look at what leaders understand, which is, is this going to impact our profits? Is this going to impact the cost of
So
doing
that's kind of a
business?
yes/no sort of thing there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and then you also want to look at what the impact is going to be, the likelihood of the impact is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Again, with single sole source or even with tariffs, right? Just because it is a single source doesn't mean it's a risk to you right now. So, what is the actual impact going to be? How severe is it going to be? How fast is it coming towards you? So, do I need a quick reaction or can I plan a longer term strategy? But then you want to take it one step further. And this is also often what's missed is you want to think about how prepared you are. So, right, when we think back to what you said about the Trinity, again, I can have a strategy. I've assessed the risk, but do I have the resources to back that up or to do something? So you assess the kind of exposure, but then you want to assess how ready am I? Do I have a plan? Have I mitigated this before? Do I even know where to start? Do I have a way to measure, which is also something people forget? How do I measure effective change? And then do I have the resources to back it up? The people, the money, the leadership support, and
Mm-hmm.
to carry that mitigation all the way to the end. And when you compare exposure to readiness, you'll start to see the deficit there to understand this is where my priorities need to lie.
I see. Okay. I want to move into the topic now of collaboration and risk tolerance. Of course, all of this is definitely related, but those poor folks over at procurement, the spotlight is really on them today to do all of this. So, how can procurement collaborate more effectively with a broader supply chain to develop comprehensive risk planning strategies?
This is another area for those of us who have been in supply chain for quite some time, right? And Bob, you've talked to enough people to know it's frustrating.
Yeah.
And we know in the last 5 years, myself included, when I was on the other side of this, right, I was all excited, as sad as that sounds, right? The silver lining of something like the pandemic was, oh, I have a seat at the table. The door's been open for me as a procurement person, right? We all were talking about that. We all said that. Things have backed down a little bit, right? And now we're back to the reality that supply chain leaders and procurement leaders tend not to be in a position of power, right, in their organizations. They tend not to be in a position of being able to make decisions.
They
And
don't have a
so
C in front of their titles,
they
meaning
don't
chief.
have a
They're
seat
not
in
in the
front of the
C-suite.
title. Sometimes, yeah, right. Or they
Wow.
still, even if they are in the C-suite, they sometimes still have to go back to the business and say, please, can I have the money for this? I often see that be the case as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
and that goes back to the business often being risk averse and thinking that risk averse means that you don't necessarily need to have big, robust strategies. So there's some of this awareness and teaching that needs to happen. But when I speak to organizations and when I think about this, we can't wait to be invited to the table. We can't wait to be, have the door open for us. It is up to the CPOs, those chief procurement officers. It's up to your chief supply chain officers to go make friends. Basically, you have to reach out to the cross collaborators, the cross functions, seek out those who do have decision authority,
Mm-hmm.
and align with them. Some casual conversations and hopefully build some sort of council or crisis team. But at the very least, you want to build those relationships because those are the people who are going to eventually give you their risk appetite and their objectives. Because when we talk about supply chain and we talk about aligning to objectives, we're not necessarily aligning to the board, right? It's trickling down to us. We need to understand when we're sourcing and when we're doing purchasing and we're writing contracts, what is finance's goals here and how can we align to those and what's their risk appetite? What are the savings they're looking for this year? What's compliance and legals? What's IT and cybersecurity? What's design and engineering operations, et cetera? So we need to reach out probably in a almost parallel peer level to build a team there and hopefully understand how we can come to an alignment on goals, objectives, and risk appetite and risk tolerance. And again, start with that word of non-negotiables. Everybody's willing to talk about the things that they will not allow or stand for, where if you start
Hmm.
trying to pressure test them on risk appetite, you're going to get a wishy-washy answer and not feel like you've actually gained any new information.
So I'm envisioning the need for the so-called cross-functional team of all the different parts of the organization to be meeting on a regular basis, to be reviewing their supplier and their sourcing strategies on an ongoing basis and make changes accordingly. Should this be a formal thing, like where this is our regular meeting and we're going to be putting this stuff on the table
Yes.
periodically? Is that something like that?
Absolutely, you want to set up a cadence. So
Yeah.
have some informal conversations, make those connections, bring everyone together to align on definitions, on your risk appetite and those tolerances, right? Because if you have a risk appetite, there's going to be always going to be some sort of plus or minus. And
Hmm.
by doing that and formalizing that, then you've set that standard. It now does a couple of things. It empowers your front line to act in their 3 foot world, if you will. So if someone on the front line who has that relationship with the supplier sees a potential risk or sees a disruption, they can act based on where that risk appetite is, knowing that they can manage it immediately versus, again, having to escalate or pull in other functions. They are setting that governance by creating that cross-functional team and guidance. And
Yeah.
then the cadence, as you said, it should be triggered by if there's a change in the world. So tariffs, that would mean I'd bring that group back together. Let's review our current risk appetite. Does it need to change? A pandemic or something else, does it need to change? Quarterly, at least biannually, but there should be a cadence for that. And frankly, there should be a cadence in general when you're looking at any of your tools or strategies, business continuity, segmentation. You want to make sure that you're looking at those things regularly. And you want to keep in mind something like risk appetite isn't static. It will change based on business objectives changing or global events. It's also not one size fits all. So it is complex enough that maybe one project has tighter risk appetite or maybe one function, right? Legal is likely going to have very, very risk averse positions. Business
Mm.
development, a little more flexible,
So
right?
each party
So
is contributing their own feeling about risk to come up with a larger risk picture. But,
completely.
it just seems like for all the efforts of procurement and supply chain to enable this type of cross collaboration, it's not going to happen unless the folks at the very top, the CEO or the COO or the like, enable this environment of collaboration. Isn't that right? I mean, there's only so much you can do if you're one of the C's as opposed to the top C.
My answer to that is yes and no, meaning I've personally experienced and seen it in many organizations where the leadership is dictating or directing, you will join this crisis team, you will join this council. And just because they're giving it that kind of lip service doesn't mean it actually works, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not necessarily bought into it. I also think that CPOs and CSCOs need to feel empowered to reach out and to educate, right? In a way to say, please finance, please engineering, please business development. Let me talk to you about how you are connected to supply chain. I'm a firm believer, and I'm not always the popular person in the room, that while most organizations think about supply chain as maybe button pushers, right? Get our purchase order out. I'm the bigger believer that supply chain is the heart of every organization and that everyone is actually a member of supply chain, regardless of their title or function, right? Because
Yeah.
everyone connects back to that. And so it is a matter of educating. It is a matter of making everyone understand their touch points within that. It's not a fast process. It's not going to be a flip of a switch, but I have not successfully seen a top-down process that's fully working, because even when you see it at the top and you have those kind of enterprise level councils, supply chain councils,
Mm-hmm.
that information is not necessarily flowing all the way down to procurement. So procurement needs to work their way up.
Oh,
It,
how
it,
interesting.
it's not a perfect solution. I will admit that, but it is where you need to start if you want to start making some of these big moves and you want to start being a little more resilient.
Because education has to bubble from below, but at the same time, I don't know if I want to say fortunately, education is certainly bubbling from above in terms of the factors that are affecting companies today. CEOs can't ignore it. They're forced to adopt this type of stance because of what's going on in the real world. So maybe they don't have to be educated that much after all. I don't know. Anyway,
Yeah, but I think by working your way up, it's almost like meeting in the middle. right?
Yeah. Oh, good point. Good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that, for this great discussion. I wish I could just interrogate you for hours more, but I do want to let the audience in on our discussion now. Audience members have already introduced some questions for you, but they should continue to do so as we speak by clicking on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can, time permitting. Now, some of these questions, Cheryl, we sort of covered, but I think they were looking for some elaboration on what we talked about. This one is asking if you could be more specific about what risk mitigation measures should we consider to address the potential for ongoing trade disruptions.
Yeah. So what you want to think about is once you've assessed your impact, you really do need to leverage those scenario plannings because that's going to help you understand what your mitigations are. When you're thinking about selecting a best fitting mitigation, it's not just one thing, it's going to be multiple things because some suppliers might react better to one area, some supplier might be more critical to you. So you really need to do a round a full comprehensive assessment of how you will be impacted. And again, what is your goal and what is your risk appetite? It's not starting with the mitigation, it's starting with your goals and your risk appetite, which then drive your level of mitigation. Do you need to do a make buy? Right? Bringing that supplier in house or do a vertical integration of some way. Do you need to completely disengage with that supplier? Do you need to dual source? Do you need to think about changing a logistical route, which then could potentially save you in terms of a tariff? Do you need to do a bonded storage? Can you go through a distributor? The laundry list is very long. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve, right? Is it just a matter of protecting yourself from price? The other thing you have to do is, again, what are your internal goals? How long can you hold on to the price and absorb it versus passing it on to your customers? And then what are your goals around that? Are you worried about brand or reputation? Are you worried about losing consumers, for example? So all of those are factors. So I can rattle off some more mitigations, but it really requires a full kind of context assessment of what are you trying to drive towards?
It's amazing that every single aspect of the business is on the table right now that you talked about in a manufacturing and distribution supply chain. Everything has to be considered. That's a lot to get your arms around. This question is asking more about these. You had differentiated earlier in our discussion about short-term versus long-term strategies. This question is asking about what long-term strategies can you implement to ensure resilience against future trade policy shifts, let alone what we're facing now. Is there something you can build into your organization that gets ready for the unexpected things that are going to happen down the line that aren't even in the picture yet?
Yeah, so this is again thinking about a little bit about the what ifs, but those long-term strategies, again, nothing necessarily new. It's a time to invest. Can you protect yourself with contract clauses? Are there insurance policies that can protect you? How does your kind of global portfolio look like? Do you need to move your sourcing? Do you need to buy, like I said, a make buy? Do you need to think about what we call reglobalization? And again, that's what I mentioned earlier about protecting the source where it is, doubling down, making sure they have more local sources so there's less touch points or movement around the globe. Those are all things that take a long time, right? Even qualifying a second source, for example, those are not typically things we can do within a couple of days or even a couple of weeks. They're long-term investments and technology, right? The other big investment you need to make is technology. If you're not using now something that helps you in terms of early sensing, giving you risk alerts, mapping your network, and also creating some sort of single source of truth of information so that you can see logistics and operations and engineering and procurement to see that more robust profile, that's another lost opportunity. Technology is not inexpensive. It can be quite costly. So it is an investment, but it is what I'd call a long-term investment, right? You're paying for it, so it helps you over a longer term plan. But it's all the tried and true things, or all the strategies that have been talked about for a number of years. It's a matter of taking that step.
Well, it does seem like most of the strategies we've been talking about today are indeed long-term in nature. It takes a while, as you point out, to change suppliers, to change locations, to change manufacturing, to change everything about that. But what about short-term? What can we do in the immediate future in order to just somehow, bolster yourself against this tirade, this onslaught of disruption that we're facing at this moment.
Yeah, this is where I would be thinking about internally again. How long can you hold the costs? Are there costs internally you can reallocate?
Yeah.
Can
Hmm.
you reach out to the supplier and talk to them about when they're going to be triggering any prices increases? Can you potentially switch to a new product or eliminate that product, right?
Hmm.
If I go back during the last 5 years, there were many times as we were seeing some of these price increases or material shortages, the answer for many suppliers was that product's going to go end of life. Is that an option? Is that the least or most cost effective way to manage this? Is that instead of trying to navigate the waters and trying to absorb some of those costs or passing them on, we're going to end of life that product.
Yeah.
So those are some of the short term, right? Obviously, there's always also buffer stock, safety stock, pulling in some of those. Again, checking your logistics lines to see can you find a second route or a different route that may help. So those are some of those short-term answers or short-term options that you have versus
Hmm.
these longer-term investments.
Sitting down, taking a look at your current contract with suppliers and sitting at the table to see if you can't make some adjustments based on the needs of the moment too. Sounds like that'd be a good
Exactly.
idea. So this word technology, you wanted us to keep bringing it up. So let's keep bringing it up. And I think
Sure.
underlying that is something that we have sort of implied throughout this discussion. And that is the importance of data. It's all about data. If you don't have this information, you don't have any ability to make decisions. So how can we use data analysis? And I think maybe that is a technology move to determine the root cause of these supplier risks, number one, and evaluate the effectiveness of different risk management techniques, number two.
Yeah, that's a great question and a complicated question, one that we could spend another hour on. So I'll try to give the short version of that.
Okay.
There's a number of ways you can use data analytics, and the first thing you want to think about is how you're managing your data now. Do you have a single source of truth? Is finance keeping one set of data and you're keeping another, and engineering another? How are you bringing that together? But you want to use data to drive action. You want your data to tell you not just, oh, we have some risk here, but why that risk is important and how it overlays onto your most strategic and critical suppliers. Again, when you lean into that technology, you will see risk profiles and you'll see those non-negotiables, and you'll be able to either prevent them or manage them from the start. So for example, when you're onboarding and doing due diligence or source selection and you have your non-negotiable list, technology will flag those things for you, right? And so you know from the start, I need to either monitor this or eliminate this as an option. And then as an ongoing basis, you can set it up to send you alerts, and you can set it up to tell you, here's where I have some risk, and go through that exercise of this is impactful, this is relevant, this is coming at me fast, this is severe, and I have plans or I don't have plans in place.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important to try and create some sort of single source of truth. But you want to make sure that you're answering questions. Don't just collect data for the sake of collecting data. You want to use it to be able to help you understand where risk is bubbling up and where you have a disruption actively occurring.
Yeah.
Whether you create something homegrown or whether you use many of the platforms that are out there in the commercial world, you have to somehow invest in that. And you have to invest in clean data. I mean, you have to invest in managing your data. Even if you can't go back 10, 20 years of the databases you have, start now going forward, because bad data gives you bad intel. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the scramble I often see. Tariffs, single sourcing. When I speak to people and they don't understand the magnitude of their problem, it's because they'll say, we don't have the data. We don't have clean data. That's got to be step one.
And there's more data than ever before, more
There's
than a
more
human
data
being
than
could
ever
possibly
before.
crunch. And so here we are talking, we haven't mentioned AI, artificial intelligence yet, but I'm sure that's got to be on the table, right?
Oh, of course, of course. There are some really great advancements, as everyone's probably hearing in the news, on AI. And I'm using AI generally. So those of you who are much more tech savvy than I am, please do not, send me hate mail on the different variations of AI. There's generative AI and all sorts of things, machine learning. And so I'm using it generally. But AI is going to give the advantage. So we've talked a lot today about, do the things that we've been saying to do for a long time. It's time to actually put those things into play. And AI gives us that opportunity because AI can help with the low hanging fruit. those more tactile button pushing tasks, can help you read contracts, can help you look at a due diligence report from a supplier and check boxes and things. That way your staff can move on to the more strategic, the more triaging risk and acting on risk and driving to your objectives. So AI is a great opportunity there. Again, the trick is AI, if you implement it within your own four walls, is going to read whatever data you have. So if you have bad data, you're going to get bad summaries of AI. So, yeah. But there's a lot of opportunity there, and a lot of the AI is also helping in mapping. So again, you want to be mapping, you want to get that visibility. AI helps to bring more relevance to that mapping than we've seen previously.
Cheryl, my head is spinning with all this information that we have absorbed in the last hour, and it's just been great. I thank you so much for answering these questions at such length and with such detail and nuance. I really appreciate it. Unfortunately, I am the bearer of bad news, and that is that we're almost out of time. We have time for one final question for you, Cheryl, and here it is. While we are very aware of the current disruptions and possible crises in the global supply chain, based on our discussion today, it also seems that there are some evergreen solutions that we need to lean into. Do you agree? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, I think we've definitely covered many of those today. I absolutely agree. They're evergreen solutions, right? All those things we talked about, all those buzzwords that we use, it's time to actually do those things and invest. So things like improving your data quality and bringing together a single source of truth, have dashboards that drive action and not just passively report the news. Those are going to be important things that we need to do better. Investing in supplier relationships and collaborating with them, it's going to foster transparency. It's going to foster you being more them feeling like you're more customer centric, loyalty and cooperation to try and solve some of these challenges. You want to really drive home the idea of using risk appetite to govern. So have those non-negotiable conversations so that you're not scaring them away with the idea of risk appetite. And it will help you get off of that more reactive hamster wheel and chasing fires because you now will know I can act because we've set up this governance. It empowers your frontline. It cuts down on churn. And it's going to save you from over-investing in the wrong places. So if nothing else, go back and start having a coffee chat, if you will, with your collaborators and your cross-functional friends about what are their non-negotiables. You're just curious and see how that conversation goes. And then, of course, to go back to what we've talked about, the importance of that balanced Trinity. We all have talked about great strategies. We use those buzzwords. You're going to go and build a great governance around non-negotiables. Don't forget resources. That's often a place where we leave a gap or we just assume we can fit it into what we currently do. And that's where your strategies fall apart because we don't have the capacity. Maybe we don't have enough people because we just think somebody can take one more thing on and fit it into their day job now. Or they don't have the skills, right? I am not going to pretend that I am a whiz at AI. Those are skills I have to build if I want to pivot in my job. So let's not put somebody in charge of the AI data or in charge of data cleaning if they have no skill set or experience in that without the proper training. And also think about what you're willing to take on as an organization. Are you willing to invest? Are you willing to add FTE, for example? Are you willing to do more enhanced training? If you're not, then you've got to adjust your strategy. Your strategy will not be successful if it's not aligned with your resource or governance. Adjust your strategy to where you're willing to, support it.
Well, thank you. The timing on this discussion could not be better considering the disruptions and the agony that supply chains are facing today. Cheryl Van Dyke at Gartner, thanks so much for your input. And audience, thank you also for sitting in on this discussion and contributing your own questions. Really appreciate that. Any questions that we did not get to, I'd be happy to. I'm sure Cheryl would be happy to address them offline. I do want to bring back into your minds the Gartner Supply Chain Symposium. Here's a quote from Sean McIntyre. He's VP of Supply Chain at Nestle. He says, "The Gartner Supply Chain Symposium has been a fantastic opportunity to connect with colleagues and partners, share new ideas, and bring inspiration to drive improvements in my organization." Also, as a longtime partner and attendee at the various Gartner symposiums throughout the years, we at Supply Chain Brain can personally attest to the value of this event. So here's the information for you about what's coming up. The Gartner Supply Chain Symposium and Expo This year's conference, you can talk about ensuring business community continuity and resilience. Discover ways to identify and prioritize potential use cases of AI integration, just like we talked about today, and improve visibility as a foundation to build resilience. May 5th through 7th, 2005, in Orlando, Florida. By the way, if you enjoyed hearing from Cheryl today, she will be there along with a slew of other Gartner analysts to help you better understand the world out there. They'll all be available. And also May 19th through 21st in Barcelona, Spain. So learn more at gartner.com/conf/SC and register with the code GartnerSCB25 for an exclusive discount. Again, Cheryl Van Dyke, thank you so much. Thank you, audience and everybody. We hope to see you at the upcoming symposium and expo. In the meantime, everybody, have a great day.